The Incheon Landing of September 1950, codenamed Operation Chromite, represents one of the most significant strategic reversals in the history of modern warfare. To understand the genesis of this operation, one must analyze the precarious geopolitical and military condition of the United Nations Command in the summer of 1950. Following the sudden invasion of South Korea by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea on June 25, 1950, the Republic of Korea, or ROK, and their initial American reinforcements were systematically overwhelmed by the North Korean People's Army, or NKPA. The NKPA was not merely a local militia, but a formidable professional force of 135,000 men, many of whom were combat veterans from the Chinese Civil War and Soviet military schools, equipped with high-performance T-34 and T-85 tanks and heavy artillery. By early August, the remnants of the ROK Army and the arriving U.S. 8th Army were compressed into the Pusan Perimeter, a defensive pocket in the southeast corner of the Korean Peninsula. The perimeter, stretching from the Sea of Japan to the Korea Strait, was a theater of desperate attrition, where the UNC forces fought to prevent a total expulsion from the peninsula. General Douglas MacArthur, the Commander-in-Chief of Far East Command and the United Nations Command, recognized that a static defense at Pusan would eventually lead to exhaustion. He envisioned an amphibious envelopment far behind enemy lines to sever the NKPA's logistical arteries, which stretched precariously from the 38th parallel down the spine of the peninsula. The strategic logic was centered on the city of Seoul as the capital and the primary hub of Korea's road and rail infrastructure. Seoul was the neck of the North Korean logistical effort. By landing at Inchon, the port city serving Seoul, MacArthur intended to create a hammer and anvil effect, with the 10th Corps serving as the anvil at Inchon and the 8th Army acting as the hammer breaking out from Pusan. This required a transition from the come-as-you-are desperation of the early war months to a highly coordinated, large-scale joint operation involving naval, air, and ground forces from across the UN coalition. The decision to choose Incheon was controversial and resisted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and senior naval officers. The harbor at Incheon presented every conceivable hydrographic obstacle to an amphibious assault, ranging from extreme tidal ranges to narrow, mine-prone channels. Despite these warnings, MacArthur maintained a mystical faith in the operation's success, arguing that the very impossibility of the site would ensure the absolute element of surprise. The primary obstacle to Operation Chromite was the Yellow Sea itself. Incheon Harbor is subject to one of the most extreme tidal variations in the world, with a range exceeding 31 feet between high and low tide. This environmental constraint dictated a rigid and unforgiving operational schedule. The harbor's approach was limited to the Flying Fish Channel, a narrow and treacherous passage where currents reached velocities between 3 and 8 knots. At low tide, Incheon transformed from a port into a vast expanse of gray mudflats, some extending up to 6,000 yards into the sea. These mudflats were impassable for landing craft and infantry alike, meaning that an assault could only occur during the peak of high tide. In September 1950, there were only 3 days when the tides would be high enough to allow deep draft vessels like landing ship tanks, or LSTs, to reach the shore: September 15th, 16th, and 17th. If the landing failed on these dates, the next opportunity would not occur for another month, a delay that MacArthur believed would allow the NKPA to either crush the Pusan Perimeter or reinforce the Incheon defenses into an impregnable fortress. Furthermore, Incheon lacked traditional landing beaches. The city front was protected by vertical seawalls ranging from 12 to 14 feet in height. This necessitated the use of improvised scaling ladders, which were lashed to the prows of the landing craft, turning the operation into a modern-day siege. The narrowness of the harbor and the presence of the island of Wolmi-do meant that the UNC fleet would have to be funneled into a confined space where a single grounded ship or a well-placed mine could block the entire invasion force. Navy experts summarized these conditions by stating that if a list of every possible geographical and naval handicap were compiled, Inchon possessed them all. To mitigate the hydrographic risks, the UNC launched a covert intelligence mission designated Operation Trudy Jackson. On September 1, 1950, a small team led by U.S. Navy Lieutenant Eugene Franklin Clark was landed on the island of Yonghung-do, approximately 15 miles from Incheon. Clark, accompanied by ROK officers Colonel K. In-ju and Lieutenant Yoon Jong, was tasked with conducting a clandestine survey of Incheon's defenses, monitoring troop movements, and verifying the accuracy of Japanese-era tide tables. Clark's team recruited over 1,000 local islanders to form an intelligence network and a defense guard. They used sampans and junks to reconnoiter the harbor, often engaging in small-scale naval skirmishes with North Korean patrols. In one remarkable engagement, Clark led a fleet of 5 sail-driven junks against a North Korean force of 6 junks, successfully sinking 4 and capturing 2, a battle that underscored the Barbary Coast pirate flair required for the mission. The most critical objective of Operation Trudy Jackson was the lighthouse on Palmy Do, which commanded the entrance to the Flying Fish Channel. The North Koreans had extinguished the light to prevent UN navigation. In his personal memoirs, Clark described the tension of the mission's final hours. The tides were exactly as the tables predicted, but the silence of the harbor was deceptive. We had identified the gun emplacements on Wolmi-do, and knew the North Koreans were beginning to reinforce the seawalls. If we could not light the Palmy-do beacon, the invasion fleet would be blind in the darkness of the narrow channel. At 0:50 on the morning of September 15th, Clark's team successfully reignited the Palmy-do lighthouse. This signal provided the essential navigational reference for Vice Admiral Arthur D. Struble's Joint Task Force 7 as it moved toward the harbor. The team then evacuated under fire as North Korean forces launched a final desperate attempt to retake the island. The organizational structure of Operation Chromite reflected MacArthur's desire for a command independent of the 8th Army. The 10th Corps was activated in late August, with Major General Edward M. Almond, MacArthur's Chief of Staff, appointed as commander. This choice was met with internal friction. Almond was an Army officer with little experience in amphibious doctrine, leading a corps whose primary combat power resided in the 1st Marine Division. The 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Oliver P. Smith, was a patchwork of units assembled with unprecedented speed. The division included the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, which had to be withdrawn from the front lines at Pusan, where it had served as the fire brigade, plugging gaps in the perimeter, and thousands of Marine reservists who were called to active duty and shipped to Japan within weeks. The 7th Infantry Division, also part of the 10th Corps, was similarly under strength and was augmented by approximately 8,000 South Korean recruits, who received only 10 days of training before deployment. The planning phase was a logistical race against time. General Smith expressed profound reservations about the haste of the operation, noting that standard amphibious preparation time was being compressed from months into weeks. However, the Marine Corps recognized that Chromite was an opportunity to prove the continued relevance of amphibious warfare in the nuclear age, a doctrine that had been under political attack by the Truman administration and the newly created Air Force. The execution of Operation Chromite began at dawn on September 15, 1950, with a massive naval and air bombardment on the Inchon area. Cruisers and destroyers from the UN fleet, including the USS Mansfield and HMS Charity, moved into the channels to engage North Korean gun batteries. The morning assault on Green Beach, or Wolmi-do, was led by the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, supported by 9 M26 Pershing tanks. The Marines found the island's defenses shattered by the preceding fire. Resistance was sporadic, and by 1200, the dominating position of Wolmi-do was secured, providing a base for the evening phase of the operation. During the midday low tide, the Marines on Wolmi-do watched as the water receded, leaving their landing craft wallowing in the mud, and their positions isolated from the rest of the fleet. It was during this waiting game that the psychological tension reached its peak. The North Koreans were now fully aware of the landing, yet the UN forces were unable to move until the evening tide returned. At 1730, as the tide rose to its second peak, the main landings commenced at Red Beach and Blue Beach. At Red Beach, located in the heart of Incheon's urban waterfront, the 5th Marines used scaling ladders to surmount the seawalls under intense fire. Veteran accounts describe the chaos of the landing. The seawalls were higher than we expected, because the tide hadn't quite hit its peak. We were throwing grenades into bunkers while still clinging to the top of the ladders. Friendly fire was a major concern. The naval shells were hitting just a few yards ahead of us, and in the smoke and darkness it was hard to tell friend from foe. At Blue Beach, the 1st Marine Regiment, led by Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, encountered thick mud and smoke that obscured the landing zones, causing several landing craft to stray from their designated paths. Despite these difficulties, the Marines established a beachhead and moved quickly to block the Incheon-Seoul highway, preventing North Korean reinforcements from reaching the port. By midnight, the city of Incheon was largely under UN control, with casualties remarkably low for an operation of such complexity, 20 killed and 174 wounded. Following the securing of Incheon, the 10th Corps began its eastward drive towards Seoul. On September 17th, the 5th Marines captured Kimpo Airfield, the most significant air facility in Korea. The North Korean defenders at Kimpo appeared surprised and had failed to mine the runways or destroy the facilities. Several North Korean aircraft, including an Il-10 and 2 Stormoviks, were captured intact on the field. The capture of Kimpo allowed the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing to operate directly from Korean soil, providing immediate close air support for the urban combat to follow. However, as the UNC forces approached the outskirts of Seoul, the NKPA resistance stiffened. The North Koreans rushed the 18th Division and other elite units to the capital, transforming the city into a bastion of barricades and machine gun nests. The battle for Seoul was characterized by Iwo Jima intensity in the surrounding ridges, such as the Ansan Yonhui complex. Urban combat within the city was brutal. Marines used transferable competence from their World War II Pacific experiences to navigate the house-to-house fighting, utilizing tanks and flamethrowers to clear bunkers built into modern buildings. On September 21st at Yongdong-po, a single Marine company, Company A, 1st Marines, held a tenuous position against repeated North Korean counterattacks, killing 215 attackers and holding the gateway to the Han River. The quantitative success of Operation Chromite often overshadows the very real experiences of those who scaled the seawalls. Raymond Johnson, a Marine veteran of the 5th Marines, provided a first-hand account of the landing's intensity. Johnson had already survived 5 weeks of combat in the Pusan Perimeter with the fire brigade before being re-embarked for Inchon. We were salts by then, but Inchon was different. There were no beaches, just a wall. We went in the first wave at Red Beach. The Navy, young sailors, panicked when a mortar hit the deck of an LST, and they fired their 40mm guns into our own boats. We lost guys to friendly fire before we even touched the wall. Once we were over, it was house to house. You never knew where the next sniper was, and the smoke from the burning city made it feel like midnight at noon. For the members of the 7th Infantry Division, the experience was marked by a rapid transition from garrison duty in Japan to the mud and hills of Korea. Sam Holliday, a veteran whose memoirs detail the lull between the storms, noted that the North Korean prisoners taken during the advance were often demoralized and undertrained. Many of the North Koreans we captured near Seoul were conscripts from the South who had been forced to fight. They were starving and had no idea how the war was going. They were terrified of our air power. One prisoner from the Seoul regiment told us he had only been in the army for 15 days. but those who were dedicated to the cause fought like demons, especially in the barricades near the Great South Gate. The intelligence mission of Lieutenant Eugene Clark also left a legacy of unpredictable audacity. Clark's account in The Secrets of Inchon highlights the humanity amidst the tragedy, particularly his interactions with the Korean locals who risked execution to light the beacon. When UN forces finally returned to the islands Clark had used as bases, they discovered that the communists had executed over 50 people who had helped the mission, a stark reminder of the cost of liberation. The technical success of Operation Chromite was a product of superior staff planning under extreme temporal constraints. Major General Clark L. Ruffner, Ullman's chief of staff, assembled the nucleus of the 10th Corps headquarters on August 15th, leaving exactly 1 month to organize 70,000 men and 261 ships. The G1 through G4 staff summaries reveal the complexity of the operation. G1 personnel managed the integration of the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade from the Pusan front and the arrival of thousands of reservists from the United States. G2 intelligence utilized aerial reconnaissance and Clark's Trudy Jackson mission to map over 200 North Korean gun emplacements around Inchon. G3 operations developed a 3-phase landing plan that accounted for the 12-hour tidal gap, including the seizure of Wolmi-do to secure the harbor entrance. And G4 logistics overcame the mudflats by using beached LSTs as temporary supply dumps that could only be refloated during high tide. The tactical air cover provided by the 1st Marine Air Wing was a decisive factor. Marines on the ground were able to call in Corsair strikes within minutes of encountering North Korean barricades. This integrated arms approach proved far more effective than the segregated air-ground coordination practiced by the Army and the newly independent Air Force at the time. The Incheon Landing remains one of the most scrutinized operations in military history. Historians debate whether the victory was a result of MacArthur's genius or a tactical success that merely masked profound strategic incoherence. Critics argue that the success of Incheon led to a mission creep that ultimately resulted in the disastrous Chinese intervention in late 1950. The stunning nature of the victory silenced MacArthur's detractors in Washington, giving him the political capital to push toward the Yalu River, against the advice of those who feared a broader war with China or the Soviet Union. Furthermore, the decision to appoint General Ullman, an Army general, over a Marine general for a predominantly Marine operation, is cited as an unnecessary improvisation that caused friction during the battle for Seoul. General Smith's reluctance to conduct the aggressive frontal assaults demanded by Ullman is now seen as a prudent measure that saved Marine lives, though it frustrated MacArthur's desire for a rapid victory. Despite these criticisms, the strategic impact of Operation Chromite is undeniable. It shattered the NKPA as an organized fighting force south of the 38th parallel and saved the Republic of Korea from total annexation. The operation demonstrated that naval power, when combined with elite amphibious infantry and integrated air support, could project force into the littoral environment in ways that could bypass fortified land defenses. Operation Chromite was a masterstroke of amphibious maneuver that overcame the tyranny of the tides and the geography of the impossible. It was an operation conceived in desperation and executed with precision, relying on the daring intelligence of Lieutenant Eugene Clark, the stoic discipline of General Oliver P. Smith's Marines, and the unwavering strategic vision of General MacArthur. While the subsequent advance into North Korea would lead to a broader and more costly conflict, the landing at Incheon remains a textbook example of how sea power can be used to achieve a decisive strategic reversal on land. The liberation of Seoul on September 28, 1950, marked the culmination of this effort. The symbolic return of the capital to President Syngman Rhee by General MacArthur signaled the end of the first phase of the Korean War. For the soldiers, sailors, and Marines of the UN coalition, Inchon was the moment the tide turned, transforming a retreat into a pursuit and demonstrating that even the most formidable geographic obstacles could be overcome by innovation, surprise, and even a little faith in the principles of maneuver warfare.